Now for our third speaker, our legend, the person who has spoken most at Imperialism on Trial events, but hasn't spoken for a while now, but the ever faithful Eva Bartlett has come from Canada. And Eva just doesn't report on countries, she goes and visits them as well and gets from the people themselves, eyewitness. Thank you. Eva Bartlett, please.
Good evening. I'm going to depart a little bit from the central theme of Julian Assange, mainly because so many excellent speakers on the panel are addressing his case so eloquently. But I want to address the broader issue of freedom of press and cracking down on journalists. And I'm going to give some examples, starting with Ukraine. And I'll give one case example, which thankfully has a happy ending, but it's one that I'm very familiar with, which is why I'm going to address it, because this particular case is one that happens again and again and again in Ukraine, to the silence of Western corporate media, to the silence of the bodies that are supposed to be concerned about journalist rights and freedoms. So in May 2018, journalist and editor Kirill Wyszynski was taken into detention, into pre-trial detention by Ukrainian authorities under the pretenses of having committed high state treason against Ukraine. And now the funny thing, that there are many correlations with his case and the case against Julian Assange in that it's so absurd, and we can clearly see how absurd it is and how there's no legal basis for holding them. In the case of Wyszynski, the evidence that was presented against him was the fact that he, as a publisher for RIA Novosti, had published 15, I believe it was 15 articles of differing opinions on what was happening in Ukraine regarding the political situation there, and it had both articles that had opinions that were critical of the government and articles that had opinions that were not critical. None of them were written by he himself, and they all had a byline stating this. And yet, 4 years after the fact, the Ukrainian authorities decided that he was suddenly very, very dangerous to the state and he must be imprisoned. So they kept him in pretrial detention, continually delaying and prolonging his detention, never actually giving him a trial. And then his case got even more absurd. I have to just take a look at my notes here. He had, there were 31 volumes of case files. Each volume had between 250 to 400 pages front and back. And he was extremely limited in the time that he could actually see these files in order to know what the supposed evidence and all this stuff that they had collected on him contained. And so I interviewed his lawyer in Kiev, and his lawyer, Andrei Domansky, actually told me that the authorities were starting to come after him in hopes that they could then prevent him from defending Kirill. But anyway, fast forward to the end, he was released in August 2019 in an exchange, although he was never actually tried, he was never actually convicted of anything. But his case, and when I was writing about this, I got in touch with another journalist, Pavel Volkov, and he told me he was subject to the same types of accusations without evidence, and he was held in the same pretrial detention center as Kirill Wyszynski on charges of, quote, infringing on territorial integrity with a group of people and miscellaneous accessory to terrorism. And then he said that in March 2019 he was acquitted, but his case wasn't fully finished. And he said basically the leaders of the 2014 Euromaidan movement subsequently occupied positions in the government, in the leadership, and they believe that anyone who wants peace with the Russian Federation, who believes that the Russian language should be the second state language, is the enemy of Ukraine. And according to him, this formed the basis of new criminal law designed to persecute politicians, public figures, journalists, and even ordinary citizens who disagree with the above. So I have a list of many journalists that are being persecuted by the Ukrainian authorities, many similar cases to Kirill Wyszynski. And I guess the point I want to make is this is being done in a state that is allied with Western nations, where we would say or our governments, I should say, would say this is a democratic state. And yet they're practicing very undemocratic, draconian practices against civilians and journalists. So that's one thing I just wanted to bring up, because it is ongoing, and again, none of these journalist bodies that I'm aware of are really looking into it. I know that when I looked into the case of Kirill Wyszynski, I couldn't even find his name in the entries of committee, maybe not Committee to Protect Journalists, but the other bodies that supposedly are concerned with journalist rights. I will move on briefly to another country. I'm not very well versed in this. I'm just aware that in Estonia, the Estonian authorities were ready to charge around, I believe it was 35 employees of Sputnik with criminal prosecution leading up to prison terms of 5 years if they didn't stop working for Russia Сегодня. And then the pretext upon that was that the Russia Сегодня general director, sanctions had been imposed on him, but what Russia Сегодня says is that the sanctions imposed on the general director have nothing to do whatsoever with Sputnik. And they clearly say that Sputnik are not included in any EU sanctions list. So these journalists are being targeted by the Estonian authorities on baseless premises. They did actually have to stop their work with Sputnik. But this is another example, and I think this is an important one to bring up, because this ties in with the whole Russia-phobic censorship of any sort of Russian media. Like, for example, last summer there was a media freedom conference in the UK, and Sputnik and Russia Today were explicitly not given accreditation. And in fact, a Canadian journalist that went there said that the journalists that he saw that were there from Canada were handpicked, who could actually ask questions to Jeremy Hunt or Chrystia Freeland, the two co-sponsors of this freedom conference, media freedom conference. And in my opinion, when I looked at the characters that were there, like Christian Amanpour or some of the worst war propagandists on Syria, for example, it was more like a regime change conference, not a media freedom conference. But this is the type of thing we're facing. And again, back to the issue of Russian media and in this case, the persecution of Sputnik in Estonia, it does tie in with all this incessant Russia-phobic content. And in my personal opinion, you may be aware, I've done reporting from Syria. What I've seen in Russian reporting on Syria has been very accurate, in contrast to the reports of the BBC, CNN, Guardian, Channel 4, CBC, etc. And I'm often, I've been accused of being on the payroll of the Russian government or something like that, because what I have written from Syria aligns quite often with what Russian media writes. But the point has been that Russia actually has correspondents on the ground, just as there are independent correspondents on the ground seeing what's actually happening in Syria, not reporting from Istanbul or Washington or Beirut. So that's a bit of a tangent, but I wanted to mention that. And finally, I just want to mention that on the issue of persecuted journalists, I'd also just like to acknowledge that there are many journalists who have been murdered, for example, again in Syria or in Palestine, while covering events, and their murders are never worthy of mention in Western corporate media, because the realities that they were covering, whether in occupied Palestine or in Syria, are not fit for print in Western media. So in 2014, I wrote an article, and I detailed some of these journalists who had been murdered by Western-backed terrorists in Syria. And sadly, at the time when I wrote it, there were 30 Syrian, Lebanese, Iraqi allied journalists that had been murdered. I would say, sadly, that number is much more. But I remember when I was researching for that piece, take for the example the name Yara Abbas. She was a journalist with Al-Ikhbariyya, and her car was ambushed by a terrorist sniper and she was killed. Now, when I found an entry on her murder in the Committee to Protect Journalists, it said, quote, Abbas, a correspondent for the pro-government TV channel, was killed when her car came under rebel sniper fire, according to Syrian news sources. And the point I want to make about that is the whole lexicon there. She's not a journalist, she's a pro-government journalist, therefore not really worthy of our attention or our concern. And of course, then to imply that it was a heroic rebel that killed her, not a terrorist, is also another form of misuse of lexicon designed to render her murder unimportant in the eyes of Westerners. So unfortunately, to add to that list, we have Khalid al-Khatib, who was killed in 2017 by ISIS shelling. To my knowledge, he didn't get a whole lot of coverage in Western press. And there's Serena Shim, who was bravely and courageously covering basically the entrance of terrorists from Turkey into Syria, and also the role of Turkey in training terrorists that then went on into Syria. 1 or 2 days before, she had a surprising car accident, a very mysterious, and I think many of us are skeptical that it was actually a car accident. She was on press TV saying that she feared for her life, that she was being threatened by Turkish intelligence, and then some days later she died. And her mother has been asking and pushing for some sort of investigation into her death, and the last time I checked, there had been none. And Serena Shim was an American citizen. But again, this is just to show sometimes people's lives matter when it serves a propaganda purpose, when you can demonize Russia or demonize Syria, whichever country America and its allies are targeting. And then most of the other times, the lives of these journalists that are killed or imprisoned don't matter. So I'm going to go way off topic just to address the issue, the situation in Syria very briefly. It's not that way off topic because it's still in the realm of media and media portrayal of events in Syria. Right now, Syria and Russia are continuing to work to liberate Idlib, liberate the civilians of Idlib. And Western corporate media, which cares so much about civilians in Syria that they will cry at the drop of a hat, are ignoring the presence of Al-Qaeda in Idlib, and they're demonizing Syria and they're demonizing Russia. We have various Western officials that have surprisingly been very honest about the fact that Idlib is infested with Al-Qaeda. I'm sure you're aware of Brett McGurk, the former US envoy, who said it was the largest Al-Qaeda safe haven since 9/11, and more recently, a muck-up on Sky News when Colonel Miles Kaggans, US coalition spokesperson, said Idlib province seems to be a magnet for terrorist groups. And said, he went on to say, they're a nuisance, there's many of them there, they're a menace and a threat to the thousands of civilians trying to make it through the winter. So he kind of screwed up Sky News's attempt to make it all about civilians. And nobody's saying, of course, that there aren't civilians in Idlib, but the whole point is, when Idlib is liberated, then the civilians will be free. And we've seen this with Eastern Ghouta and Aleppo and many places prior. You may also be aware that a week or so ago, Aleppo's countryside was liberated of, terrorists in the countryside were eradicated. And this did not get, to my knowledge, any play in the corporate media, but if you were watching Syrian social media channels, Syrian media, Russian media, independent media, you would have seen Syrians celebrating the fact that for the first time since the war in Syria began, they were truly free of terrorism in Aleppo city. So I'd like to just close by recommending a really excellent article by Canadian author Stephen Gowans. I don't have the name at hand, but you can Google Stephen Gowans. He makes the point, he points out the hypocrisy of how the West demonizes Syria and Russia for fighting terrorism. And I think every one of us, if we asked what would we do in our countries if our city, our province, whatever, was overrun by terrorists, what would we expect of our government? And the answer clearly is that they would stop the terrorists so that we would not be slaughtered and maimed, so we would not worry about our children and loved ones. So I'm just going to quote from Gowan's article. He says, the Syrian army, backed by the Russian and Iranian allies, launched an offensive to liberate Idlib. It's done this because Al-Qaeda's attacks have never stopped, and because the government of Syria has an obligation to protect its citizens and control its own territory. We ought to applaud the actions of the Syrian military along with those of the Russian and Iranian allies, not deplore them. These actions are blows against reaction, oppression, and foreign aggression, and in defense of democracy on an international level, as well as the furtherance of the welfare of the Syrian people. Thank you.